Hey there, Mr. Terry here, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, we're coming back with a new friend of the channel, Lavader. And boy, Lavader fans have been pumping this video in my video suggestions. I can tell he is gaining a very devout following. So this video is called, Why Did Kaiser Wilhelm II Get Rid of Bismarck? Now, Lavader videos usually include him making like a take of some kind. Really develops kind of a thesis. Depending on them, maybe it's more of a hot take. And these are great for history. I wanted to see a little bit more specifically where he might be going with this, and I looked at the description, and it says, the dismissal of Otto von Bismarck by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890 is seen as one of, if not, the biggest mistakes that Kaiser could have made. Although everyone agrees that the dismissal was a mistake, few people are aware of the reason why he was actually dismissed. In this video, I want to make the point that perhaps it was time for Bismarck to retire, and that the Kaiser's decision was not a mistake at all. Okay, maybe going against the grain a little bit here. By the way, Lavader was one of the winners that we've had on the episodes of History Showdown recently. That's my history trivia game show. By the way, if you're watching this the day it comes out, we are having our next episode, and it is an awesome lineup. It's going to be an American military history night. We got the Fat Electrician, Habitual Line Crosser, and Chris Cappy from Task and Purpose. You will not want to miss it. I'll link the stream down below, and if you don't make it for the live, that's fine. It's going to stay up. All right, let's get started. And if you did miss the History Showdown with Lavader, check that out. It was really funny. We also had Living Ironically in Europe and Starfarv on the show, and these guys just roasted each other. It was a blast. I'll link that down below too, so you can check that out.
Otto von Bismarck, a name every single one of us heard at some point, and a name many people hold in high regard. Bismarck has gone down in history as one of its great men, maybe not as high up there as Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar, or George Washington, but he is still part of that list, even if a few numbers below. The architect of the empire and German unification.
I would say actually that he, especially in like Western studies with like the United States or something, in world history classes, we've tended to dismiss the 1800s a lot. To be honest, it often will just be like, okay, you go like French Revolution, and then you jump into like Industrial Revolution, little touch of imperialism, and then World War I. A lot of the political realignments that happen in Germany in the mid to late 1800s, Europe in general, I should say, often gets, I'll be honest, even as a teacher, gets kind of brushed past.
Forging the nation, in his own words, by iron and blood, created the first welfare state in the world, and what subsequently followed was a golden age for Germany, both economically and scientifically, and none of that would have been possible without his firm and enlightened guidance. But all of that changed in 1890, when a young and ambitious prince came and sat on the German throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II. In that year, the new Kaiser dismissed the...
Yep, that one. You'll learn a lot about him in World War I, aren't we? But yes, dismissing the legendary founder, almost, of the modern Germany?
Kaiser Wilhelm II. In that year, the new Kaiser dismissed the Iron Chancellor from his position of power, which came at horrible costs according to many. The dismissal of Otto von Bismarck is regarded as the first and probably among the worst mistakes the Kaiser could have made.
This is an interesting little comic here. If you look at it, there's a lot going on here. So Otto von Bismarck's like, all right, fine, peace, I'm out of here. Here, Kaiser Wilhelm, hold this. I mean, yeah, you got socialism. Can't see some of the other stuff. We're down there. Oh, and by the way, don't mess with the Balkans. Did not heed that advice, did he?
Bismarck was the architect, quite literally, of the new German Golden Age, and the dismissal is seen as proof that the new Kaiser acted unreasonably and in a selfish manner. Everyone is aware that Wilhelm was more eager to involve himself in political matters, unlike the laid-back approach his grandfather, Wilhelm I, took. He was ambitious and, most importantly, pretty stubborn at times to carve out Germany's place in the world. And yet, despite everyone saying that the dismissal of Bismarck was a great mistake, few people actually take the time to ask the big question. Why? Some assumptions get thrown around that Wilhelm was very stubborn and wanted his own way, ignoring the advice and criticism of the Iron Chancellor, or that the two clash in the realm of foreign policy. While there certainly are a few videos that go a little bit deeper and shed some more nuances on the matter, the consensus among many people still stands that the dismissal was a great mistake. This is...
By the way, this, I don't know what this movie is. but especially from like the eyebrows down, this guy looks pretty good. Like from here, it really does look like Bismarck. Maybe not up top here, but like here down. I don't know, maybe you just need the mustache and that just like puts it all together.
This is one of the topics I did not give attention while making my documentary on Kaiser Wilhelm II almost 2 years ago.
Oh,
but
Wilhelm?
since I have pledged to revisit Willy again with more of the knowledge I gathered since then, to revise and shed some more light on the things I talked about.
Okay.
And what better way to start this revision off than with a misunderstanding?
Wilhelm doesn't get a lot of love. Okay, you see way more love for Bismarck than you ever do Wilhelm. So this will be interesting to see that, you know, that perspective.
Student skewed topic. In this video, I will be exploring the relationship between Kaiser Wilhelm II and Otto von Bismarck and the causes that led to his dismissal. I want to make the case that this was not a reckless and moronic decision as many were led to believe, and that perhaps by 1890 it was time for the Iron Chancellor to take his leave for his own sake. But first, we need to explore the relationship between the two before the coronation of 1888.
Okay.
For the sake of fairness, despite having my own little biases, I will not be using the memoirs either from Bismarck or Wilhelm as sources in this video. Both speak of what happened from their own view and make the case for why they are right.
I am not real familiar with, again, these, the memoirs is, I guess, autobiography almost, or not autobiography, but yeah, memoir. So it's their own writings and stuff. So I would be interested if you guys are well-versed in these sources. Let me know down in the comments what they said their kind of point of view on the matter was. I'd be interested in hearing. Let me know down below.
And in the end, it will just turn into another he said, she said situation.
Right.
If I take Wilhelm for his word, then what reason is there to not take Bismarck for his word?
We gotta look at the secondary sources.
So the memoirs will be left out, and I will be relying on various historians and eyewitnesses from that time instead to make my case.
First and secondary
While
sources.
the Kaiser was still a prince, there really weren't that many interactions between him and the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck was not exactly too interested in the prince and focused more on his career. But despite that, as he was growing up, the prince developed an admiration for the Chancellor and his ways, and sought to perhaps one day be just like him. Later on, when it was established that Wilhelm's father, Frederick III, had throat cancer, it became apparent to Bismarck that he didn't have that long to live, and this meant that the young Wilhelm would ascend the throne much earlier than other people had thought. And since Wilhelm was still young, it all turned into a battle of who could influence him the most. Bismarck's primary rival in this regard was Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee, who became a close confidant in Wilhelm. And because of that, Bismarck saw Waldersee as a threat to his political authority. Utilizing his political power, he would influence Waldersee's inner circle with bribes, blackmail, and general manipulation. He even tasked his son, Herbert von Bismarck, with monitoring the two closely and gaining some kind of leverage over the prince. It was typical of Bismarck to use such methods to attempt to control the crown prince. He had derogatory articles printed targeting his opponents.
This is one of those things that's going to happen in any type of monarchy, especially absolute monarchies, where your heir may be very young and there's going to be a lot of time before they really mature and really start kind of like making decisions on their own. So there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, grooming. It comes to mind in China when this would happen, where you would have these dowagers, basically these people that would rule on the behalf of a young heir because they're not of that age. You know, they may be an infant, you know what I mean? But yeah, you would constantly be having these people kissing your butt as a youngster, again, to groom you, because they either want maybe power for themselves, or again, they want an agenda to come across. Maybe they had failed with the previous ruler that had, you know, passed away recently. A lot of motivations. But yeah, one of the things that can happen in the monarchy.
Ruining their reputations with all kinds of scandals. And this control even extended to Wilhelm's own parents, as he did not want their more liberal ideas influencing the boy. You see, there is something you must know of how Bismarck in general operated in his political career.
The current status quo
Bismarck was a control freak in everything he did. He wanted to be involved in all matters from domestic affairs to foreign affairs, and kept everyone around him under his thumb.
That's one of those things we kind of talk about, like absolutism, but the idea that, you know, leaders they really want to be a part of all the decision-making processes. And not all leaders like that. I mean, a lot of leaders are like, yeah, you know, I'm into like the cultural stuff, maybe even the military stuff or economic stuff, but like getting involved in everything, that can also be really challenging to be good at, because how can you be really good at all those things at once? You got to be very smart, very well educated. And that's why in a lot of ways, I feel like there are few rulers that can really ever pull that off and really ever have.
Especially Kaiser Wilhelm I, who throughout his reign mostly just sat back and let Bismarck do all the work for him.
I mean,
he was also, as everyone around him knew, extremely stubborn and always took an uncompromising stance. It was either his way or no one's way at all. Jonathan Steinberg's biography of the Iron Chancellor contains a lot of these instances, but I will quote one incident involving the King of Saxony. He respected nobody and paid no attention even to his royal visitors. On the 20th of April 1880, King Albert of Saxony had an uncomfortable hour with him. When the king uttered a differing opinion, Bismarck changed his expression and the king immediately yielded. It is Bismarck's misfortune, the king declared, that he cannot listen to a contrary opinion and immediately conjectures ulterior motives. Everyone does his will, the Kaiser first of all. This was...
By the way, now that I'm looking at dates, did I say 1781 earlier when I was talking about German unification? I meant 1800s. And I probably already got a whole bunch of those comments. I've been dealing with the 1700s in my teaching recently, so I have 1700s on the brain. I apologize if that was the case. You don't need to go and scroll back, but if that was the case, whatever. And if you were going to correct me, I guess you can delete your comment. Okay, but yeah, you can see the influence here, you know, of Bismarck was huge by these other authorities here. Maybe that's something that the young Wilhelm II kind of picked up on and didn't want to go that route.
Was most apparent when examining the relationship between him and Kaiser Wilhelm I. Since he was the king and later Kaiser, Wilhelm was Bismarck's superior. He had the right to give him orders, fire him, and so forth. And yet in reality it was completely the other way around. It was Wilhelm who was under Bismarck's thumb, so to say. Anytime he and the Chancellor would disagree on an issue, Bismarck would threaten to resign, and since the Kaiser saw him as irreplaceable, he always yielded to his demands. Historian Christopher Clark, in his book about the history of Prussia, had this to say in regards to their relationship. Bismarck never behaved as if he had a boss. This was most glaringly apparent in his relations with Wilhelm I. As Chancellor, Bismarck frequently pushed policies through against the monarch's will. When the king created obstructions, Bismarck resorted to tantrums and fits of weeping, backed up by the threat, sometimes unspoken and sometimes explicit, to resign and to return to the comfortable peace of his estate. When Bismarck wanted to consolidate his relationship with the monarch, he generally did so not by endearing himself directly to the sovereign, but by engineering crises that highlighted his own indispensability, like a helmsman who steers into the storm in order to demonstrate his mastery of the ship. Wilhelm I...
Interesting to see that, but again, I guess you gotta put this more on Wilhelm I for allowing this to happen, and obviously he liked him, or at least liked, you know, what he was doing. Maybe it was like a plausible deniability thing where it's like, okay, I am the emperor, but hey, if you didn't like it, hey, it was Bismarck. It was Bismarck. It wasn't me. All right. It wasn't me. I know I'm the leader technically, but you can blame it on him, right? It's like win-win situation. You could take credit for his successes, but then deny any type of contribution to the failures.
Himself was even noted to have said once in a conversation, "It is hard to be Kaiser under Bismarck." And his influence over the young Wilhelm II was strategic. He wanted it to be business as usual and make sure that the crown prince would be as willing to let him do things without interruption as his grandfather. Prominent British diplomat Sir Robert Morier, in a letter written to Queen Victoria, would discuss the relationship between the two and what Bismarck had planned with the young boy. The objective of Bismarck has been and is to isolate the crown prince from all persons not immediately under his influence. He knows that the prince is a man of non-optimistic character and that this isolation acts upon him in a depressing manner, and he believes that he can depress him into submission. Now, I am not necessarily saying all of this to criticize Bismarck's character and make him look like a bad guy. There is nothing inherently wrong about the way he is handling stuff. It is political power 101, and without it, he wouldn't be in the position.
Might makes right if you want to make that kind of argument. Just because it's political 101 doesn't necessarily make it good or necessarily not bad.
Position he was. Rather, this attitude and personality and the way he handled and influenced Wilhelm II sets the stage for the upcoming conflict between the two of them. Wilhelm despised the domineering and controlling attitude of Bismarck, and he did not want to be or be seen as his puppet, and he was not willing to take a submissive role similar to his grandfather. So,
I think the context of all this is important too. With Germany only recently unified, there's a lot of people you have to keep happy that have largely given up power with the unification of all these German states. I think Bismarck probably understood that because they're saying, and Wilhelm too, I guess, with kind of this hands-off more approach there.
So already taking into account their personalities, this was something destined to happen from the get-go. Bismarck wanted to contain and keep the soon-to-be Kaiser under his thumb, and Wilhelm was not having any of that, and wanted to be independent of the Chancellor's metaphorical chains. The question wasn't whether they were gonna bump heads, the question was when and who was gonna come out on top in the end. Crown Prince Wilhelm
as long as you have the crown and an institution that protect that, I don't know if he has to worry about that as much. It just sounds like he doesn't, Wilhelm just doesn't want to be, I guess, manipulated like his father was, maybe.
As German Emperor and King of Prussia in June 1888 after his father passed away from throat cancer, and immediately when he got a hold of the ship's steering wheel, he got to work implementing his visions. Wilhelm's primary focus was in the realm of domestic affairs and sought to reform the empire from within and make the empire a stronger economic powerhouse than it already was. Yeah. But at the same time,
it was already on that path, man. When Germany did unify there, they went into industrial overdrive. They really did. That era up to that point was really dominated, of course, by the British economically. But by the time of the 1900s, the industrial capacity of the Germans was so incredible and even surpassing the British in a lot of ways. It's pretty amazing what they did about 30 years.
He also had to deal with Bismarck, and considering the way Bismarck handled stuff, the two of them clashed many times over domestic issues. Bismarck tried to undermine Wilhelm and his efforts to still retain the complete oversight and control he had. For example, in an effort to improve housing, transport, and industry, Wilhelm gave individual ministers the complete freedom to do as they saw fit without having to seek approval either from him or the Chancellor.
It's that same thing. It's like the people that you feel are also threats. I guess he felt Wilhelm as a threat, but all of these other, little princes and stuff, you give them autonomy. Again, context is important because, this is only a recently unified thing. And you got to make sure that the powers that be that existed before still feel like they have influence, still feel like they have something at stake when it comes to ruling their historical regions.
Believing that this would accelerate efforts so they aren't slowed down by bureaucracy, only to learn sometime later that Bismarck was impeding their works by insisting that every decision they made had to be sanctioned by him, directly going against the freedoms the Kaiser provided them. Or, probably worse, was when Wilhelm was shocked to learn that every letter and report that was addressed to him was intercepted by the Chancellor beforehand, with him sometimes even censoring certain parts of letters and reports. And
to have that kind of power, he's got to have a lot of people, again, that can intercept that stuff, unless he's the one sitting there sneakily hiding behind the mailboxes. But there has to be a lot of people that apparently are in on that. I don't know, unless he was going to extort people in the mailroom that weren't getting those letters across. I wonder how he was able to obtain so much of this from the king, the emperor.
He would even go as far as to issue out contradictory orders in secret to undermine his authority. As you can probably imagine, the Kaiser was not exactly happy with what Bismarck was doing and increasingly saw him as an obstacle when it came to his visions. But notice something, and this is very important. Wilhelm and Bismarck weren't clashing over foreign policy issues, but rather domestic issues.
Yeah. I mean, they're both imperialists. They're trying to, again, supercharge Germany on the global stage. They've got a lot to make up when it comes to the imperial race that has been going on. We're going to have Scramble for Africa coming up here. You're already competing with the French and the British, who have these massive global empires. So, yeah, they were imperialists.
As I mentioned in the beginning, many people have the impression that the source of conflict had been foreign policy, but in that regard there was very little disagreement compared to domestic issues. Okay. Wilhelm had fully intended to continue Bismarck's foreign policy, with Christopher Clark writing in his biography of the Kaiser, in a speech given before the provincial parliament of Brandenburg on the 8th of February, the text of which was immediately passed to the press. Wilhelm had demonstratively aligned himself with Bismarck's foreign policy. There is one aspect of Bismarck that also needs to be brought up, something I have not really seen anyone talking about,
the mustache.
which almost definitely contributed to the troubles he found himself in. When Bismarck was dismissed as Chancellor, he was 75 years old, an old man in every way possible at that time. And due to this old...
75 can be very different to certain people. We have presidents that are that old. 75 can be a really hard age, and one where you're 1 foot into the coffin, but for some people are killing it at 75.
Age and a few other factors, Bismarck had suffered deteriorating mental health as the years went by, and this had an impact on his role as Chancellor, especially in regards to domestic affairs. The Bismarck who had just taken power in 1862 seemed like a completely different person compared to the Bismarck in 1888, and it was clear to pretty much everyone in his circle that he wasn't the man he once was. In his final years, Bismarck's rages became increasingly erratic and irrational. In addition, he seemed to be experiencing paranoia and delusions.
If you are starting to have mental deterioration, brain deterioration, this is a common thing. It's, similar to like a TBI victim, a traumatic brain injury victim, where as your brain starts to lose some of its functionality, it becomes hypersensitive and hyper defensive because it feels like it's, under attack, which can give more moments of rage and paranoia there. And then eventually, if it does settle into like Alzheimer's or something, then you can't even process paranoia and delusions almost. It's very sad.
He began to distrust those around him and believe they were plotting against him. Steinberg documents a few instances in his biography that showed his worsening mental condition, already starting in the mid-1870s. Bismarck's physical and psychological condition deteriorated during 1875. He slept so badly that he often received cabinet ministers and officials in bed. His temper worsened, and the smallest irritation, a servant not placing a chair somewhere quickly enough, would cause an outburst of uncontrolled rage. So you have a man who is very controlling and wants to have a firm hand and oversight over everything, and then his mental health starts deteriorating, making him more irrational, paranoid, and prone to outbursts of uncontrolled rage. This was a ticking time bomb.
Couldn't even stamp right at this time.
Bismarck would attempt his boldest stunt in German politics since the formation of the empire, which would result in the Kaiser dismissing him as Chancellor. The clash over the quote-unquote social question.
Okay, so we interested to see a little bit more of this. I'm learning a lot. There's a lot of nuance to this and details that I am not real strong with, so it's maybe why you're not getting as much pushback like maybe some of you are. You Bismarck, big Bismarck fans or Wilhelm haters. That's probably why you're not hearing it. So I'm going to be very open to hearing a lot of your interpretations here in this one. And then, of course, I'm sure the stuff that I'm going to see down in the comments, and I hope I do see in the comments there.
The social question was one of, if not the most important reform effort spearheaded by Wilhelm during his early years as Kaiser. It primarily concerned workers' rights, and the Kaiser aimed to improve the conditions of the working class. He advocated for things like disability insurance, limited night work, Sunday rest, child protection, and higher wages.
So this is now out of context too, because as it's getting into, again, the 1880s, you are seeing these problems that have come with industrialization. We see it in Britain. We're going to see it in the United States. These countries that were real, on the forefront of that, of seeing the negatives of the Industrial Revolution. And if you want to, keep some stability there and also not plunge your country into the growing of like socialist movements, you're going to have to find ways to pretty much compromise with the platform of workers. And it looks like Wilhelm was catching wind of this, unlike, say, the Russians, where that doesn't go as well. And, you get the Russian Revolution. But countries like Britain and the United States also, I think, caught wind of this early enough that they were able to prevent workers' revolutions and find compromises for the platforms of the working class.
Just to name a few, the Prussian Minister of Agriculture, Robert von Ballhausen, would hear the Kaiser declaring that a great deal has to be done to prevent capital from consuming labor, since most industrialists exploit workers ruthlessly and ruin them. And his efforts even went a bit to the extreme, like, hold on, let me check my notes here, threatening to raise the villas of rich industrialists if they didn't raise wages.
Oh, snap.
This great sympathy
Based AF Wilhelm
towards the working class
Wilhelm
actually came from his upbringing. Instead of the usual Prussian aristocratic and militarist upbringing, his tutor would also make sure he engaged in other activities.
Like what?
Like, for example, bringing the crown prince to inspect factories, talk to workers, and even work alongside them for several hours as if he was just another employee. And
well, yeah, he's coming from a different background than, say, some of the other leaders, not coming from he's coming from aristocratic background, not like the capitalist, industrialist kind of background that you would see in these other democracies. So more of the classical stance of how power and wealth is given. So I don't know, maybe he's also getting wind, and when you see this in other countries about how oligarchies in a way are almost starting to be developed while these rich industrialists are becoming so powerful. You saw that in the United States. This is that era of the robber barons and these guys that were totally buying off elections in local and national politics, presidential elections. So he's going to have a different background than, say, some elected president like a McKinley or something in the United States that has this huge backing and really rose through politics by being pro-industrialist, pro-capitalist,
And thanks to this exposure and experience to a lower-class lifestyle, he developed a great sympathy towards the workers and pledged to improve their standard of living.
He loved Wilhelm, huh?
As you can imagine, the social question was kind of a big deal for Willy. And he was actually following in the footsteps of Bismarck with his efforts, since he had also taken a similar stance in the past. Bismarck believed that by improving the conditions of the workers, he would cripple the support base of the Social Democrats. And that is why under him the German Empire became the first welfare state in the world. But now in the late 1880s, let's just say he had a mild change of opinion in that regard. Another effort by the Kaiser was to abolish the infamous anti-socialist laws introduced by Bismarck to combat social democracy with force, like banning or censoring their publications and outlawing trade unions. Bismarck was very keen on having these laws extended, as the deadline soon approached. And so he came up with a grand strategy to not only extend the laws, but also strengthen his own power in Germany, which was starting to wane, and make the Kaiser submit to him. You see, there was an ongoing worker strike happening in the Rhineland, with the Kaiser working to tirelessly mediate between the workers and employers.
The Rhineland was a critical part of German economy, as that whole, Rhine River, valley in a way was heavily industrialized, a big part of the industrializing of them in general. It also is also why it was devastating to not be able to protect it with like a military force and almost see it pretty much annexed after World War I by France, because it was one of the major economic veins of Germany. So yeah, you got to keep that region functioning.
So, what did Bismarck want to do in regards to the strikes? Well, it's the simple act of gunning down striking workers in the streets. So here is how it worked. Make the strikes escalate and create domestic political chaos by introducing even harsher anti-socialist laws, which would undoubtedly cause more demonstrations and protests from workers, bringing Germany on the brink of civil war, and then ride into the German parliament as the savior and crush the petty socialists once and for all.
I don't know what kind of evidence we have of this kind of being a plot. And did it need to be a plot like that, or couldn't he have just been this hardcore anti-socialist? Isn't that just as plausible?
Not only would the anti-socialists and crush the petty socialists once and for all. Not only would the anti-socialist laws be extended, but also made harsher, and at that point the Kaiser would have made himself unpopular, so Bismarck could force his hand and re-solidify his rule.
What's the evidence
of this?
It was
simply genius.
Is it more conjecture?
Christopher Clark would write on this plot by Bismarck as follows. Bismarck seems to have had a range of options in mind. He had long taken the view that harsh repression was the only means by which the state could meet the challenge of the social democratic movement. If the strikes and turbulence were allowed to continue with minimum state intervention, this would weaken Reichstag resistance to the new and more repressive anti-socialist law favored by the Chancellor.
In this specific potential strike, what were the demands of the strikers, or these people on the verge of striking? What were they looking for? I mean, was it just the classic working conditions, better pay, insurance, those types of things? What was part of that? If you know, let me know.
If this tactic failed, there remained the extreme option of a coup d'etat, with the risk of ensuing civil war. In such difficult and unpredictable circumstances,
Germany was close to
that.
It was
foreseeable that Bismarck would possibly emerge, much as he had during the Prussian constitutional crisis of 1862, as the only person capable of maintaining the ship of state on an even keel.
This looks like a
As
job
German
for me.
politician and journalist Rudolf Augstein wrote in a Spiegel article in the late 1980s, commenting on a new Bismarck biography that had been published, deliberately, in order to prove himself indispensable, he sought to create domestic political chaos.
I have seen a lot of just kind of conjecture and stuff like that, but is there anything concrete, or is just like, again, conjecture, I guess, just something that seems like it would fit his character, right? I don't know enough. Or if there is enough.
And when Wilhelm learned of the newly proposed anti-socialist laws by Bismarck, the
deeper plot, other than being
anti-socialist, you have to imagine that he was not exactly happy. Wilhelm was aware that just the fact that the bill would be introduced and debated on would cause enormous protests to erupt across the country.
Why?
So he requested Bismarck to tone down a few of the more controversial points of it, and Bismarck refused. And it was then that the Kaiser finally put his foot down, and the newly proposed anti-socialist laws were struck down as they were being introduced to Parliament. And historian Katja Heuer would elaborate on what went down in her book on the German Empire. Is
it coming back down to socialism again, ripping these countries apart?
Heuer would elaborate on what went down in her book on the German Empire. Wilhelm, wanted to be loved by his new subjects, and the way to achieve this was not with a bloody massacre of workers. Bismarck had got used to decades of Hohenzollern submission, and so did not move an inch, expecting Wilhelm to give in. Instead, this was the opportunity the Reichstag had been waiting for. After years of Bismarckian domination, even former allies like the Central Party politician Peter Reichensperger now sensed that the Junker's time was up, and they let this anti-socialist bill collapse. Going behind the Kaiser's back, issuing out contradictory orders, reports, and letters meant for him was one thing. Hatching up a plot to cause a domestic crisis and bring the empire on the brink of civil war so he can march in as the savior was a whole different thing. And
this is again, we're just kind of reiterating how confident we are in this bigger plot for him to use this to his advantage rather than him just straight up being an anti-socialist. Again, got to see some of those arguments and the strongest arguments out there. I just don't know.
And that is when the sovereign decided that Bismarck was much more trouble than he was worth. So, the Kaiser approached Bismarck with one more possible compromise. In his eyes, Bismarck could not be allowed to interfere or have a say in domestic affairs anymore, and for that reason, the Kaiser demanded Bismarck's resignation as Chancellor, but still recognizing his skills in foreign affairs, was willing to still have him on as foreign minister. As long as Bismarck kept his hands out of domestic issues and worked his magic in other countries, the Kaiser would be satisfied. But, unsurprisingly, considering the kind of man Bismarck was, for him, it was either Chancellor or nothing. So, he promptly rejected the Kaiser's offer. And at that point, there was no other way. Compromise was attempted, but to no avail. There was only one thing left to do. 2 months later, on the 20th of March 1890, the Kaiser officially dismissed Bismarck from his position as Chancellor of the German Empire. The differences and clashes in domestic politics at last reached a breaking point, and the Kaiser came out on top. On the 22nd of March, Wilhelm would have an audience.
Maybe he needed him a little bit longer. I mean, we see how their foreign policy is going to totally screw them over in World War I by getting involved in these conflicts. So I don't know. Maybe you should have kept him around a little longer, or at least maybe took some more of his advice. Or do you think he was just so sick of Bismarck that he's like, I don't care what advice he was giving me on foreign policy, even though I respected it before, I'm just gonna like do the opposite. Oh, stay out of the Balkans? How about we encourage an invasion of the Balkans or something?
With the British ambassador to Germany, Sir Edward Mallet, and during that audience the two of them discussed the reasons for the dismissal of Bismarck. And in his official report back to London, this is what the ambassador noted from their conversation, and Wilhelm's thoughts on the whole fiasco a few days ago. Wilhelm spoke about the long history of his differences with the former Reichschancellor regarding the workers' protection issue and the socialist law. He accused Bismarck of deliberately wanting to escalate class conflict to the extreme, with the intention of then sweeping the streets clean using grape-shot ammunition. Quoting Wilhelm directly here, but for me, a young monarch who had just ascended the throne, and for my entire house, it would have been catastrophic if I had allowed my people to be shot down in the streets without even investigating their grievances.
Let the quote go, but I think politically that's probably a smarter move than what you're going to see. Again, look what the Russians did to a lot of that dissent around this similar time. Multiple little mini revolutions happening there. And they were always kind of a step behind, I feel like. And he's trying to sort of get ahead, I guess.
People would have said that I only knew how to rule with bayonets. However, instead of listening to him, Bismarck had secretly tried to undermine his, Wilhelm's, social policy initiative and treated him like a schoolboy. And as for Bismarck, he would live the rest of his life in retirement on his estate in the town of Aumühle. But to say that he was still politically involved would be an understatement. He would continue holding meetings with certain people, give interviews, and
he didn't like being retired.
Of all, he operated a giant smear campaign against the Kaiser using newspapers and interviews to his advantage. You know the widely common myth that Wilhelm was mentally unstable? Those come directly from Bismarck's campaign against him.
It's propaganda.
And this campaign didn't just spread rumors and misconceptions, but even went as far as leaking private government documents and treaties.
You're being petty.
Like in 1896, when Bismarck leaked a secret non-aggression reinsurance treaty between Germany and Russia in an effort to damage Wilhelm's reputation abroad.
Another one? They had one before Ribbentrop? Oh my gosh. Look at Tsar Nicky. There's Nicky, his cousin, by the way.
Or probably his worst stunt, when he almost single-handedly ruined German-Russian relations by falsely telling the Russian ambassador to Germany that he had resigned over Wilhelm's supposedly anti-Russian views and policy. And this caused such an outrage in the foreign ministry that the Kaiser was seeking legal action against him.
They were family.
After hearing that Bismarck had falsely told the Russian
Queen of
ambassador
England was their grandma.
that he had resigned in protest at the Kaiser's anti-Russian policy, Wilhelm repeatedly contemplated legal action on grounds of high treason, and a preliminary inquiry was instigated to this end by the Reich Office of Justice.
I mean, what do you think about Kaiser Wilhelm II's attitude towards Russia? Basically from this point on until World War I, right? We know they're going to try to, it seemed like in their letters between Nicholas and Wilhelm, try to, try to keep the other from escalating the war, but they didn't really de-escalate stuff on their own. Did Germany want to go to war with Russia? And again, it's a family affair because these guys are related.
And due to Bismarck's reputation and him being seen as a demigod that forged the German Empire, he was virtually untouchable despite all the efforts by Wilhelm and his ministers.
Somebody farted, he had to open the window.
Claims. And the fact that to this day,
That
the
guy
commonly held beliefs that Wilhelm was mentally unstable and that Bismarck resigned over foreign policy disagreements do actually demonstrate that he was successful in the end and really got the last laugh. So, considering everything I have talked about, I believe the fair conclusion we could make is that the dismissal of Bismarck by Wilhelm II was perfectly understandable, and perhaps Wilhelm had done him a favor and let him live out the rest of his years in peace. While perhaps you could still make some arguments as to why dismissing him may have been a mistake, I think that at this point the common caricatures of Wilhelm dismissing the Iron Chancellor over petty reasons, his own ego, irrationality, are just completely untrue.
This is again where I'm just circling back. I don't know about what the levels, I guess, of drama about his dismissal of Bismarck. So I'm taking all this with a grain of salt, of course, especially if, this is going to be seen as like a hotter take against the grain take. But again, let me know a little bit about what's kind of been the common interpretation of this dismissal. A lot more I need to know.
From Wilhelm's point of view, there was a strong case to be made that it was time for Bismarck to retire, considering the deterioration of his mental condition and the stunts he pulled in regards to the social question. And this was also not an entirely unpopular decision in Germany at that time.
Okay,
Plenty of
public
people,
opinion?
and even the millions of workers,
yeah.
definitely let out a sigh of relief. A prominent
It makes sense for the working
critic of Wilhelm from that time, Paul Busching, had to give credit to the Kaiser in this regard in 1908. Is it a coincidence that the impression of Wilhelm II's first decisive act, the dismissal of Bismarck, has been entirely blurred over the decades? Let us recall that on March 28, 1890, the Kaiser did not stand alone. There were millions who wanted to mark the resignation of the first chancellor as the beginning of a new era of healthy, free development. These people were alienated by Bismarck's administrative methods, his economic policies, and his views on the workers' question and socialism.
It's like and probably the younger people, right? The younger generation, this next generation that are like, all right, Bismarck, okay, boomer, you got to go now. Okay, boomer.
Now, I know that throughout this video I have been, well, pretty harsh on Bismarck, but despite all this, I do not hate him, far from it. I still admire him and his works. He was, after all, the man who forged Germany in iron and blood. If it wasn't for him, the German Empire as we know it may not have existed, or would have looked very different. But even if we hold him in such a high regard, we must not forget or make the mistake of seeing him as infallible.
That's a good point for everything. I don't care who it is. People get caught up in the history community in just great man history, and again, these infallible mythological figures. We are like so desperate to find spotless heroes. And that shouldn't be what we're doing in history, because you're not going to find one. And if you do think there is one, you've probably been misinformed.
By the 1880s, the man who once masterfully wielded iron and blood to forge an empire had begun to show signs of decline. Age and the toll of decades of unrelenting political dominance had transformed him into a figure increasingly driven by paranoia and irrationality. He just was not the same person from the years we remember him in history for. Yet,
he already
it should
peaked.
also really be said
better in the
that
1860s
these final
early
years
70s.
should not overshadow his earlier brilliance. To judge Bismarck solely by his later actions would be to ignore the profound impact he had on shaping modern Germany and indeed Europe itself. His achievements were monumental, and his vision of a unified German state remains a testament to his political genius. He was, after all, a human being, prone to the same frailties and
Cut him some
limitations
slack.
as anyone else. That he faltered in his final years and could not live up to the shadow and image he once established for himself long ago does not diminish the heroic stature of his life's work. In the end, his resignation in 1890 was not merely the result of personal conflict with Kaiser Wilhelm II, but perhaps a necessary transition.
It almost seems, okay, it looks like he's about to get to it. I was going to say is just a changing of the times, a changing of the climate of what it meant to be a citizen of this industrial world. I think the larger global context is very important to see how things are changing societally.
The political landscape had evolved, and so too did the needs of the German state. It was undeniably time for Bismarck to step aside, allowing a new chapter to begin, and letting a younger and perhaps even more ambitious captain to take the steering wheel. So let us honor him, not for his imperfections,
one of his
but for
statues?
the enduring mark
That
he
looks
left
Soviet.
on history. His name deserves admiration, his story respect, and his humanity understanding. Ironically, this is the exact same thing that Kaiser himself advocated in his own later years while writing his memoirs. I know I am technically breaking my rule from the start, but since I have made all of my points and arguments, I feel that it is fitting to end this video with one final quote from the man he had always clashed with. Prince Bismarck's greatness as a statesman and his imperishable services to Prussia and Germany are historical facts of such tremendous significance that there is doubtless no man in existence, whatever his party affiliations, who would dare to place them in question. For this very reason alone, it is stupid to accuse me of not having recognized the greatness of Prince Bismarck. The opposite.
I mean, I guess, again, he still said he could be the foreign minister. It's a major position, so he didn't just have a quick out for him.
Is the truth. I revered and idolized him, nor could it be otherwise. It should be borne in mind with what generation I grew up, the generation of the devotees of Bismarck. He was the creator of the German Empire, the paladin of my grandfather, and all of us considered him the greatest statesman of his day, and were proud that he was a German.
A boomer.
Bismarck was the idol in my temple, whom I worshipped. But monarchs are also human beings of flesh and blood. Hence, they too are exposed to the influences emanating from the conduct of others. Therefore, looking at the matters from a human point of view, one will understand how Prince Bismarck, by his fight against me, himself destroyed, with heavy blows, the idol of which I have spoken. But my reverence for Bismarck, the great statesman, remained unaltered.
All right, very good video essay here. He, put out his thesis. He, framed the arguments in the way, that he wanted to, and, gave the textual things that kind of supported what he was saying there too. But again, I did have some questions too for if you are a lot more knowledgeable about this. One of the biggest ones was how plausible was it that there was an actual plot to pretty much undermine Wilhelm that went with kind of pushing the anti-socialist stuff, and then he would come and clean it up and be the hero. That's where I wasn't quite sure. It was basically just like them. He was showing a couple authors that just kind of presented the same arguments and just thought that that's what Bismarck was doing, but I didn't really see much about the plot with that, but I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just don't know. So that would be something to look at in here. You know, I read a lot of essays and get a lot of essays as a teacher, especially in my AP classes where students have to make argumentative essays, you know, about history. And one of the things we always teach, and it's trained me to look out for, is what nuanced arguments are being out there. What are the counter arguments? And do you bring up the counter arguments when you make your argument and explain why your argument is better than the counter arguments? That's what makes the healthiest and most convincing and most legitimate of all types of argumentative essays. Same thing in, of course, the video forms, the same idea. So that's the stuff I'm always looking for as a teacher. All right, with that, thanks a lot. Again, if you had not seen Lavader win, and maybe I spoiled that, sorry if I did, but maybe you already knew. But if you didn't see him compete on History Showdown with Starve Harv and Living Ironically in Europe, definitely check that out. And again, if you're watching this today, come join us live tonight for the next episode of History Showdown. But if you're watching this a little bit later, the links are still down there. I think if you have not seen my History Showdown, my history game show series, I think you're really going to like it. It's a lot of fun. I bring some of the best history YouTubers out there and other kind of history adjacent people, and we have a really fun time doing trivia, and it is a lot of fun. I've been really proud of it. All right, with that, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.